This episode of Wasteland may contain mature themes, profanity, and descriptions of sex, graphic violence, and criminal activity. Listener discretion is advised. In a previous episode of Wasteland entitled That Which Is Hidden, I profiled several supposedly occult or satanic crimes that had taken place in my home state of Florida. I compared these incidents to similar and more well-known occult crimes that were alleged to have taken place elsewhere in the U.S. The conclusion I reached was that the words occult, satanic, and witchcraft are often applied to crimes with a ritualistic bent by a fear-mongering news media. And it only takes a little bit of digging to show that what may at first seem ritualistic is often an attempt at appearing ritualistic. Or it's simply a case of mistaken identity, of applying a label where none is needed. In the case of the West Memphis Three Arkansas teens were imprisoned for 18 years for the murders of 3 young boys. The killings were horrific, savage crimes, and almost immediately the idea that the murders were connected to Satanism became ingrained in the public consciousness. Surely no one could commit such barbaric acts as these without demonic assistance. The murders occurred in 1993, but it wasn't until 2011 that Damian Eccles, Jesse Miskelly, and Jason Baldwin were finally released, having been sentenced to time served in the light of new forensic evidence. The 3 men's shattered lives notwithstanding, their release meant that there was still a murderer out there, guilty of this terrible crime. It seemed to me that the evil committed in the case of the West Memphis Three wasn't so easily quantifiable as satanic or occult. It was something much worse, faceless, unknowable, and easily hidden. People didn't want to consider that a human being could do something so vicious without influence. And that was the point I attempted to make in my previous episode. Evil isn't so easily categorized. To call something satanic is usually erroneous and often dangerous for the accused. Those of us who are brought up with even a small amount of religion are conditioned to think of the Christian devil as the ultimate embodiment of evil. Anything that exists beyond the boundaries of so-called normal criminal behavior, especially where violence is concerned, well, it's satanic. At least, that's what I was told growing up in the 1980s. In the mid-80s and even up into the early 90s, you couldn't turn on the TV without hearing some mention of Satan. Every episode of 2020, Geraldo, Donahue, nearly every show my devoutly Catholic grandmother had on in the background while she babysat me was profiling the horrors of modern Satanism, child sacrifice, and occult murder. I was a child during the height of the satanic panic, and the message was beaten into our heads at home, at school, and on TV. The devil is real, and he'll get you if you aren't careful. As I got older and became a fixture in my local punk rock scene, I, of course, began to question the things I was told all my life. I discovered that Satanism is more of a philosophy than a religion, and ritualistic violence and/or sacrifice is not usually a part of the Satanists' dogma. So walking around with a Slayer shirt displaying a pentagram wasn't sinister. It was funny, and it pissed off the squares. It didn't mean anything except that I didn't buy what the mainstream was selling. And as a college-educated adult, it became incredibly easy to laugh off the many fringe theories I'd grown up hearing. The preschool hysteria of the 1980s, backwards masked heavy metal records leading to teen suicide, the satanic kidnappers waiting just behind the bushes of my bus stop. It wasn't real. In 2015, I became aware of one of the darkest crimes I've ever heard of. It occurred during the early 80s in Omaha, Nebraska. It was known as the Franklin Scandal. When I say that it isn't possible to tell the story of this network of monstrous child abusers, dark money, and murder here on Wasteland, I'm not being hyperbolic. I wouldn't do the victims justice at all. I don't have the resources to properly research it, even if I had the confidence needed to record it. Others have fared far better than I in telling the story. I encourage anyone who is interested to read or listen to Nick Bryant's 2009 exhaustively researched tome, The Franklin Scandal. It will not only shake your faith in government institutions to its very foundation, but it will reveal that your ceiling for the depravity of others is woefully low. I first encountered the story of the Franklin Scandal on an episode of one of my favorite podcasts, The Last Podcast on the Left, a simultaneously educational, hilarious, and irreverent true crime and horror show. The Franklin Scandal took up a big chunk of their 3-part series entitled Satanism and the Government. And to this day, I've never heard anything as harrowing as those episodes, even with all the hosts' humor thrown in to soften the blow. And yes, true to the series' title, Satanism and the Government, the Last Podcast hosts did cover the alleged satanic angle of the Franklin Scandal. But it wasn't until late 2021 that I finally finished Nick Bryant's book, and I noticed a distinct lack of evidence for actual Satanism being involved in those particular crimes. But what happened in Omaha, it was so shocking, so evil, it had to have been satanic. Well, now here I was, a knowledgeable, well-read adult, as I like to imagine myself, sounding exactly like those televangelists and talk show hosts I've been subjected to as a kid. As enlightened as I sometimes fancy myself, I now realize that even I'm not immune to this irrational moral turmoil. It took learning about a truly horrific series of crimes to get me to that point, but despite all my objections, I was suddenly a part of the same screaming, panicked mob. I realized that I too could be susceptible to the same hysteric jumps in logic as everyone duped by Michelle Remembers was in the 1980s. I began to reconsider what I had tried to communicate on that episode of Wasteland, that evil isn't so easily pigeonholed. I began to wonder if maybe I was missing the point. Regardless of whether a culprit is a quote-unquote official Satanist, committing a crime for a truly esoteric reason, or simply a misinformed outsider lashing out and clumsily dedicating their crime to some darker power, they've still done something terrible, something far beyond the boundaries of what is tolerated in society. The result is the same, satanic or not. Good is inverted, evil is elevated. And maybe, sometimes, run-of-the-mill adjectives aren't enough to properly describe what's left behind. I don't condone the careless accusations leveled at so many innocent people during the 1980s, but I've begun to understand ever so slightly the outrage and fear that people feel when confronted with something that shatters their perceptions. The word satanic doesn't have to be literal. If it isn't weaponized, maybe it does go a long way to summing up something particularly terrible. And until a better adjective gets here, sometimes it's the only word that seems to make sense. This story happened in Port Orange, Florida in 1990, about 5 minutes away from where I grew up. And I never knew about it. When a child goes missing, the parents of that child become attuned to certain things that they never noticed before. Ensuring the porch light stays on all night, every night. Straining their ears for the turning of the front doorknob. Finally hearing a voice, that one voice they've been waiting for, on the other end of the phone line. These unfortunate parents also pay more attention to when a body is discovered. They're wrapped by those news stories that we often gloss over or turn away from because they're just too sad. While we change the channel or click on a different website, the parents of missing children hold their breath, awaiting one of two outcomes. The first is that the body doesn't belong to your child. So your nightmare will continue unabated. The second is that the body does belong to your child. Subsequently, one nightmare ends while another, much darker one begins. And it's the one that may never go away. On the morning of February 15th, 1991, I imagine Diane Whittington letting out a long-held breath that turns into a ragged sob. The news has finally reached her that the body discovered behind the Port Orange fire station last month belongs to her daughter, Tammy. The 14-year-old had been missing since late last year. Diane had reported her daughter as a runaway on November 30th of 1990. Neither Diane nor Tammy's lives sound like they were easy. They, along with Tammy's two older sisters, Bridget and Angie, left Concord, New Hampshire in 1979 to escape Diane's abusive, alcoholic husband. According to Diane, her husband had once beat her so horribly that he had ruptured her Achilles heel. And like many people with something or someone to hide from, the family headed for Florida. Once Diane and her daughters were settled in Port Orange, things seemed to go well enough. Bridget, 25 at the time of Tammy's disappearance, eventually moved an hour and a half north to Jacksonville, and both Tammy and Angie were doing well in school. Tammy was entertaining the idea of becoming a veterinarian when she was older, as the young girl loved animals. Diane once entered her daughter's bedroom only to find it inhabited by a gopher tortoise. Diane herself had found a job as a waitress. But this placid, run-of-the-mill environment would be shattered as Tammy and Angie reached their teenage years. Both girls ran away from home frequently, leaving their single mother frustrated, scared, and helpless to do anything. Diane begged the Port Orange Police and the Department of Health and Rehabilitative Services for help. She pleaded with HRS to help get Tammy into a state-run facility, but to no avail. When Tammy was finally found in the spring of '91, her sister Angie was 16 years old. She too was a chronic runaway, and despite, or perhaps because of what happened to her sister, Angie left home too, ignoring the warnings from her mother and Port Orange police that she would, quote, wind up dead just like Tammy if she didn't behave. With one daughter tragically dead and another unaccounted for, Diane's outlook was understandably bleak. The beleaguered mother told the Daytona Beach News-Journal that she didn't even have insurance on her daughter and would have to wait until after Bike Week to afford a funeral service. Bike Week, of course, has always been a lucrative time for servers and bartenders, and it keeps some afloat for the entire year. The same article reported that the state of Florida offered to pay for Tammy's burial expenses, but Diane had responded, "The state refused to help keep her alive. I don't want them helping me now that she's dead." Tammy's body had been discovered by an adult and two children who were deer tracking just south of the Port Orange fire station on Trailwood Drive. Even today, this area is still mostly wooded and very quiet, though more subdivisions and gated communities have sprung up there since the early 90s. Tammy was found adjacent to the East Coast Railway tracks that bisect the area. These tracks run north and south from Jacksonville to Miami, cutting right through the greater Daytona area. Tammy was found only a few blocks away from the home she had run away from in November of 1990. Tammy's remains were skeletal, and they had been interred in a shallow hole. They had also been burned. It didn't take long for investigators Robert Vail and Bernard Boucher from the Volusia County Sheriff's Office Major Crime Unit to narrow in on two suspects, John Bradley Linsons and Judson Ronald Vetter, both 17 years of age. In fact, within 5 days of the discovery of Tammy's remains on February 20th, the two teenagers were in custody and charged with first-degree murder. John Linsons was a high school dropout and a resident of Port Orange. However, at the time of his arrest, he was living on campus at the Earl Clements Federal Job Corps camp in Morganville, Kentucky. Job Corps is a program administered by the U.S. Department of Labor that offers free education and vocational training to young people aged 16 to 24. Job Corps caters primarily to troubled and disadvantaged kids looking for a way to improve their lives. Linsons had presumably been at the school since early January when their spring semester started, with just over 800 miles of distance between himself and the callous brutality he had wrought back home. Judson Vetter was actually a resident of Merritt Island, a Central Florida town famous for the Kennedy Space Center, located just over an hour south of Port Orange. The investigators from Volusia County arrested him at his home with the assistance of local law enforcement. While being transported from Kentucky back to Florida, Linson spoke candidly with investigator Robert Vale. When he was asked why he had murdered Tammy, Linsons responded, "I wanted to see what it felt like to kill somebody." Linsons also told Vale that in the winter of 1990, he and Vetter were living in a makeshift camp in the woods just off Spruce Creek Road. And according to Linsons, that was where they both practiced Satanism and played Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons, first published in 1974, is a role-playing, imagination-based game created by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. The idea for D&D was essentially a derivation of miniature war games, which were themselves a more complex version of the board games enjoyed by both Gygax and Arneson. However, the rub with D&D is that instead of realistic armies fighting on a battlefield, the gameplay consists of characters grouped into a party, engaging in medieval fantasy adventures, most often comparable to something like The Lord of the Rings. These player characters can be represented by miniatures on a game board, often homemade, or, to give the game a more modern flair, on a projected screen. Or the characters can simply exist in the player's imaginations. D&D sessions are overseen, or refereed for lack of a better term, by a dungeon master. This person drives the action, putting the party in different scenarios where they must think creatively and battle monsters and other human foes to survive and progress. As each challenge is overcome, the player characters rise in level, gaining additional points to their stats and higher quality armor and weaponry, i.e., each character gets stronger and more versatile the longer they play. And most importantly within the game, all important choices and decisions are determined by the rolling of dice. Though the rule-heavy Dungeons & Dragons can prove to be a daunting undertaking for new players, the game exploded in popularity by the early 80s, surpassing 3 million players by 1981, which of course put it square in the sights of those televangelists I mentioned earlier, and the right-leaning Christian conservatives who watched them, no pun intended, religiously. Due to the illustrated D&D rulebook incorporating some satanic foes such as devils and demons, as well as depictions of scantily clad female humanoids such as succubi, the burgeoning phenomenon began to garner negative publicity. It was alleged by many people who had never played D&D that the game promoted devil worship, witchcraft, murder, and suicide. To play D&D was to take away one's inhibitions and common sense, causing a player to mistake the fantasy world for reality. Despite the ridiculousness of such unproven claims, like the many other instances of moral outrage in the 1980s, this alleged connection between the popular role-playing game and Satanism was rarely questioned. So, for a brief period, Dungeons & Dragons joined heavy metal and horror movies as yet another pariah of the satanic panic. And it was the story of 17-year-old James Dallas Egbert that drove the ire of so many misinformed moral crusaders and would-be investigators alike. James Dallas Egbert was a child prodigy from Dayton, Ohio. He had been born in 1962 and was already in his freshman year at Michigan State by the age of 16, where he was majoring in computer science. James always had an interest in science fiction and went to as many sci-fi conventions as he was able. For lack of a better word, James was the quintessential 1970s nerd, consumed by books and primitive computer programs. When asked about her son, Anna Egbert told the newspapers, At age 12, he had his own programmable calculator and he programmed it to play games with him. An impressive feat, especially when considering home programming was in its infancy in the late 70s. But this description, along with James's advanced academic prowess, should go a long way toward describing the solitary existence the young man led. Being that James's interests seemed to be reclusive and more imagination-driven, it was only natural that he would become a dedicated player of Dungeons & Dragons. Aside from his sci-fi conventions, it was one of the only times James would come even close to socializing, albeit with a small group of like-minded individuals. However, on August 15, 1979, James disappeared. When his dorm room was searched by police, they found a handwritten note suggesting he had decided to commit suicide, as well as a collection of poetry which James had written. One of the poems, entitled Final Destination, appeared to hint that James was dissatisfied with his life. Probably a town up ahead, maybe a farm. Probably could make it, wouldn't be too hard. If I can find a reason, then I'll leave the car. At the moment, I just don't know where the reasons are. Whenever I decide there's a place I'd like to be, soon as I can find there's a goal to be achieved, come the time I'm down that there's something left for me, then I'll go. But until then, I think I'd rather sleep. James's mother remarked that the room had been left so neat and organized, which was completely unlike her son. On the wall was a bulletin board displaying a strange arrangement of pushpins. And perhaps even more bizarre, the handwriting on James's suicide note didn't look like it was written by him at all. The whole situation was deeply troubling, leaving investigators guessing and considering a host of theories. Had James chosen to commit suicide? Or had he been abducted with the note left behind to throw investigators off the scent? Had he, under intense academic pressure, simply chose to leave school using suicide as a diversion? And what, if anything, did the pushpin pattern mean? Investigators soon discovered there was a group of students on the Michigan State campus who frequently played Dungeons & Dragons, though they played a live-action version of the tabletop game. In the gaming community, play acting your character, often with costumes and prop weapons, is known as LARPing, or live-action role-playing. It isn't the same thing as D&D, but the two practices can share some basic similarities. The group of LARPers from Michigan State utilized a maze-like system of steam tunnels located beneath the campus as the backdrop for their gaming sessions. To be honest, it was the logical choice, as photos of the tunnels show they were a comparable stand-in for a medieval dungeon. The tunnels housed pipes that carried heat and energy to buildings across the campus complex, but they were more than large enough to accommodate a fully upright person. With James's interest in D&D, speculation soon turned to the steam tunnels and the possibility that James had become lost in the maze while engaging in a game. James's family enlisted the help of a private investigator named William Deere. After examining James's dorm room, Deere began to lend credence to the possibility that James's disappearance was the result of a role-playing game gone wrong. He pointed out that the strange arrangement of pins on James's bulletin board were crude map coordinates, and they corresponded to the warren of steam tunnels under the college. The news media seized on the alleged culpability of D&D in the disappearance and began to report it as truth. During the first few weeks of James's absence, Deere was interviewed several times by local papers and television. During one of these interviews, he said of D&D, "You have a dungeon master. He designs the characters. Someone is put into the dungeon, and it is up to him to get out. In some instances, when a person plays the game, you actually leave your body and go out of your mind." Deere's description of how D&D is played is incorrect. His version sounds more like an escape room, which is more of a puzzle game with no role-playing elements. And as for the notion that D&D resulted in players experiencing psychotic breaks with reality, this is just wild speculation. Of course, this line of thinking should sound familiar if you're a child of the 80s, 90s, or even the 2000s. We all heard the same accusations leveled against violent video games, horror movies, hip-hop, and heavy metal, the harmful effects of which have still never been conclusively proven. To his credit, Deere did purchase the Dungeons & Dragons rulebook. He also paid a dungeon master to direct him through a campaign to understand the game and the effect it may have had on James. Though this interaction may have been well intended and most likely a bit comical, the research produced no results. James remained missing for several weeks until Deere received a phone call from James himself. The missing teen confessed that he was hiding in Morgan City, Louisiana, located about an hour and a half west of New Orleans. Deere traveled to Louisiana to retrieve James and to discover exactly what had happened to the young man. When James finally revealed his story, as is to be expected, Dungeons & Dragons had absolutely nothing to do with it. Being labeled as a child prodigy wasn't easy for James. In fact, it was more like a curse. He was under constant pressure from his parents to excel in his studies. James told Deere of a conversation he had with his mother only days before he elected to go missing. James called to tell her he had earned a 3.5 GPA, but she admonished him for not achieving a 4.0. That exchange and the following one are taken from a book called The Dungeon Master, which Deere eventually wrote about the case. On the topic of the academic pressure he was under, James told Deere, "There was never enough time, the way I was living. Interruptions, pressure, my parents hounding me. I wanted my life to get simpler, and it just got more complicated." James confirmed Deere's hunch that the pushpins in his dorm room were a map of the Michigan State steam tunnels. James also admitted he had written the suicide note with his left hand to obscure the penmanship. "I meant it as a combination map and suicide note. The map would show where I was if you could find me. The note, the message I intended to convey, was that I was dead. Of course, if that's how it turned out, I didn't really know what was going to happen." Not only was James struggling to go above and beyond in his studies, he was also grappling with being gay. At his young age and being somewhat withdrawn, he just didn't know how to tell anyone, especially his family. James finally buckled under the pressure and entered the steam tunnels with some cheese and crackers, a small bag of marijuana, and a large quantity of sleeping pills, intending to commit suicide in a room he had selected on a previous expedition into the maze. However, the plan didn't work, as James awoke hours later finding himself very much alive. He left the tunnels, walked to a friend's house, and eventually boarded a bus bound for Chicago and then another one for New Orleans. Dejected, James attempted suicide again, consuming cyanide while in New Orleans. After this attempt also failed, he moved on to Morgan City, working for a few days at a carnival before giving himself up to Deere. The investigator returned James to his family on September 13, 1979. But James never received the help he so desperately needed. Less than a year later, on August 16, 1980, James Dallas Egbert shot and killed himself. William Deere's book, The Dungeon Master, was published in 1984, and it told the true story of James's motive for committing suicide, that it had everything to do with academic and parental pressure. But since that narrative wasn't as sensational as a game that makes its players kill each other, no one seemed interested in speaking about James's true rationale. The realization was too little and too late for a morally outraged public. In 1981, author Rona Jaffe fictionalized the case of James Egbert in her novel Mazes and Monsters, which was adapted into a made-for-TV movie starring Tom Hanks. In the story, a group of LARPers act out their adventures in an abandoned mine, and Hanks' character suffers a psychotic breakdown. The climactic scene features Hanks justifying a deadly jump off a bridge because he possesses spells. Like most TV movies from the 80s, it's not particularly well done or thought out. Also in 1981, another similar story was published, the young adult novel Hobgoblin, written by John Coyne. In it, a teenager becomes dangerously obsessed with the titular role-playing game, which is based on Irish mythology. There was even an anti-D&D advocacy group in the vein of Dare or MAD. It was called Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons, or BAD, and was led by a woman from Richmond, Virginia named Patricia Pulling. Her son Irving tragically committed suicide in 1982, and Pulling blamed his interest in role-playing games. Certainly, public perception of D&D at the time didn't help this jump to conclusions. Pulling unsuccessfully sued the publishers of D&D, as well as the principal of her son's high school, claiming that he had placed a curse on the teen. As to the nature of the curse, or to what end it was cast, that was never determined. At this point, it should be obvious to anyone familiar with the Satanic Panic that Patricia Pulling embodied a bit of an archetype, the moral crusader who sees evil in even the most innocuous of places. The parallels between Patricia Pulling's litigious hysteria and the infamous, unsubstantiated accusations of satanic ritual abuse alleged by Judy Johnson against the McMartin preschool in 1983 are evident. It's an old story. Thankfully, none of Pulling's lawsuits resulted in the wrongful imprisonment of anyone. Unfortunately, the same can't be said about Judy Johnson. Ironically, the sales of Dungeons & Dragons surged during the Satanic Panic. This echoed a pattern that would be repeated for the next 3 decades when parental advisory stickers were slapped on quote-unquote offensive records. Still, the high sales only emboldened televangelists, talk show hosts, and crusading anti-occult parents to try banning the game at every turn. By 1990, there was still a stigma associated with role-playing games. So when James Linsons and Judson Vetter were arrested and charged with Tammy Whittington's murder, their D&D hobby was a topic of focus in the local news media. Strangely, it was reported on more than the fact that both teens were underage, homeless dropouts, somehow living unnoticed in woods just a stone's throw from several housing developments. It should come as no surprise that some investigators even suggested that, much like in the case of James Egbert, the game had driven Linsons and Vetter to commit their horrific act. And considering what happened, the idea that Dungeons & Dragons made them do it would have been preferable. At least it would have been easier to understand. By the night of December 2nd, 1990, Tammy Whittington had been missing for 2 days. At the time, this was still by Tammy's choice. Unbeknownst to her, her agency in this decision would change soon. Tammy most likely didn't want to go home, but was resigned to returning eventually. That night, she may have been prolonging the inevitable when she stopped at the Jiffy store, located on the corner of Spruce Creek and Nova Roads, to pilfer a bottle of wine. She was less than a mile from home. Tammy, accompanied by a friend known only as Keith, used the payphone outside the store. Who she called is unknown, but what is known is that this was the last official sighting of Tammy, presumably by the store clerk, before she disappeared. Tammy and Keith were drinking the bottle of stolen wine behind the store when John Linsons and Judd Vetter approached them. Linsons and Vetter's camp was also located less than a mile away, just up Spruce Creek Road. Coincidentally, the two 17-year-olds had come down to the Jiffy store to steal some beer. The foursome eventually headed south down Spruce Creek Road in the direction of All Children's Park. All Children's Park was something of a local attraction throughout the 80s and 90s. It was a massive labyrinth of wooden crawl spaces, monkey bars, and slides. It was the type of place that kids would unfortunately not be allowed to play at today for fear that one of them might get hurt. But to an imaginative preteen, it was a massive play space for kids to act out pirate battles, space duels, and, come to think of it, with its many hidden spots and above-ground tunnels, it would have been a perfect setting for a live game of D&D. During the day, All Children's Park was a bustling place teeming with children. But at night, as many local high schoolers know, it was dark and silent, the perfect place to hang out and get drunk or high without being disturbed. Whoever Keith was, it turned out that he and Tammy were slightly more than friends. While Linsons and Vetter occupied themselves, probably drunkenly running around on the playground, Keith and Tammy had sex. Keith left the park soon after he and Tammy were finished. At that point, Tammy was all alone with Linsons and Vetter, a situation she surely would have rectified if she'd understood the danger it presented. Tammy didn't realize that the two older boys had become jealous of the attention she had given to Keith. They had decided they didn't want to be left out. The boys offered to walk Tammy home to the trailer she shared with her mother and sister Angie just up the road. It is unknown at this point if Tammy actually agreed to end her latest sabbatical and head home. Maybe she had decided she was ready to be back with her family after spending the past 2 nights out in the cold. And if she did decide to return home, perhaps feeling safe with the escort Linsons and Vetter offered to provide, then it's even more heartbreaking that she never made it. The 3 teenagers decided to take the scenic route back to Tammy's, moving through the woods at the edge of the park, then following the railroad tracks north to Tammy's adjacent neighborhood. While they walked, both boys tried to convince Tammy to show them the same amount of affection that she had shown to Keith, but Tammy refused. It's unknown at what point Linsons and Vetter decided to act, but when they did, things happened fast. Linsons broke off from Tammy and Vetter and went into the woods. Tammy might have assumed he was going to hide for a few moments before jumping out to scare them both. But that isn't what happened. As Tammy and Vetter continued their stroll along the railroad tracks, Linsons emerged from the woods, quietly removed his gray t-shirt, and rolled it into a gag. As Vetter distracted her, Linsons snuck up behind Tammy. Before she could react, Linsons quickly looped the makeshift garrote over Tammy's head and cinched it around her neck. Struggling, Linsons strangled Tammy into unconsciousness. At that point, both boys knew they had a limited amount of time to do what they intended to do, so they dragged Tammy into the woods by the railroad tracks and took turns. When they had their fill, Linsons finished what he had started with his t-shirt. He strangled Tammy to death. Using their hands, Linsons and Vetter dug a shallow grave right there by the railroad tracks. They put Tammy in the hole. Vetter took one of Tammy's braids as a trophy. He later said it was, quote, something to remind me of the fun I had that night. The boys didn't cover Tammy's body. Instead, using palm fronds as kindling, they burned her. The alleged influence of Dungeons & Dragons on John Linsons and Judd Vetter was initially mentioned by the Daytona News-Journal in February and March of 1991. It was even reported that Linson's holding cell had to be scrubbed of graffiti, though a scrawled message reading "Satan lives" was photographed and sent to prosecutors. But it soon became apparent that D&D seemed to have had no hand in what the 2 teens did to Tammy Whittington. They were perfectly capable of making those monstrous choices themselves without the influence of imagined dark elves, warlocks, and dragons. By August of 1991, Vetter decided to plead guilty to second-degree murder and rape, 2 charges that each carry a maximum of life in prison. Still, it was preferable to the death sentence hanging over his head. Vetter was probably aware that Florida didn't stand on ceremony when it came to usage of the death penalty. In 1990, 4 inmates were executed, and with 4 months still left in 1991, another 2 inmates had already gone to the electric chair. Vetter knew his only chance to stay alive was to inform on Linsons and make a plea. By October, Linsons also decided to plead guilty to first-degree murder and rape. A conviction of first-degree murder does open one up to the possibility of execution, but since a lengthy trial wasn't pursued, neither was the death penalty. Both Linsons and Vetter were sentenced to double life terms on November 27, 1991, just under a year since they murdered Tammy Whittington. Prior to his sentencing, Linsons had half-heartedly attempted suicide but was unsuccessful. The incident was downplayed by Linson's attorney, Michael Lambert. Still, the by then 18-year-old tried to achieve a bit of notoriety for himself. On the day of his sentencing, Linsons appeared in court sporting a small Hitler mustache, ostensibly his version of Richard Ramirez's crudely drawn hand pentagram. Ironically, it was Linsons himself who brought up Dungeons & Dragons after investigators in the media seemed to drop it. Shortly before he was put away for life, the Daytona Beach News-Journal quoted Linsons as saying, "We decided to, have some fun before we killed her. I guess you could relate it to D&D, because D&D is the spells and stuff." The article quotes Linson's further as saying they burned Tammy's body as a sacrifice to Satan or to conceal the crime. This quote is very telling. It seems that by the conclusion of the trial, neither Linson's nor Vetter were even sure why they had done this awful thing. The two teens were sentenced by Circuit Judge Sean Brees, who said he found the case to be, quote, vile, atrocious, and outrageous. Tammy's mother, joined in court by her daughter Angie, summed up her feelings thusly. I hope they're tortured every day of their life in prison. I hope they rot in hell. Oftentimes, a case like the tragic murder of Tammy Whittington is depicted on TV and in entertainment as what happens when something hidden and evil breaches the placid normalcy of everyday life. A satanic murder, it points to some sort of suburban conspiracy, a streak of rot on a pristine canvas, a bleak underworld that exists just beneath the surface. David Lynch's Blue Velvet, Nick Pizzolatto's True Detective. These stories take viewers down into a labyrinth of darkness and depravity that exists adjacent to their own cleanly scrubbed worldview. It's a well-explored mystery and horror trope. Of course, it was also the core idea of the Satanic Panic. Just look closer and you'll see it. The devil is in the details. And these things don't just disappear from the collective unconscious. They fester. The DNA of the Satanic Panic continues to be replicated in things like QAnon and Pizzagate. Moral crusaders aren't a thing of the past. They're still here, clanging the bells, warning all of us that things are not what they seem. And yes, sometimes, though not very often, that is true. But most of the time, things are much like they are in this story. Brutal and simple. The only thing occult about Tammy Whittington's murder was the fact that the two teenage boys who killed her were able to hide in plain sight. After all, that's what the word occult means, hidden. And as far as Satanism goes, whatever John Linson's intentions were when he burned Tammy Whittington's body, does it really matter? He put a stain of terrible darkness on the world, and in some ways, by the basest of definitions, that is satanic. After all, much like any other belief, there are many different interpretations of Satanism. It just so happens that in Western culture, the evilest thing most people can imagine is the devil. Is their interpretation correct? Is the Bible's depiction accurate? Is Satan a corporeal being, a nebulous idea, a myth? Does he really make others do things they wouldn't otherwise do? Or is there simply a shadow cast by human nature, under which all the worst things we are capable of live and thrive? When it comes to innocent people being falsely accused of outlandish crimes that even the most monstrous of us could not conceive of, the moral panic surrounding Satanism is a destructive and dangerous thing. But consider this. As far back as the most ancient of myths, when the devil does rear his head, the best practice has always been to call the demon out by name. In doing so, it gives one power over the demon. And perhaps it's just that simple. If we are unlucky enough to be touched by evil, we must give it a name. This episode of Wasteland was researched, written, produced, recorded, edited, and in some areas, scored by me, Michael Paul Anthony. If you'd like to contact the show, the email address is wastelandpodfl@gmail.com. I want to thank you for listening, and if you like what you heard, please share it with a friend. Until next time.